All right, thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm going to make this interactive as we go. There are going to be some times when I'm going to be asking for volunteers, asking people to chime in. So just to start, times are very different now from, when each of us took our last positions, when we started our career, certainly when we got our degrees. The thing is now being a former CEO or CFO, having a board certification or attending, an academic governance program may mean you're fit to be on a board, which is kind of like having a license to drive. You're fit to drive. But it doesn't mean you're going to be a future any value contributing board member, or as I told my kids when they got their licenses, there's a difference between having a license and being a good driver, because there are so many different interdependent factors, things you have control over, things you don't, things you need to look out for. And it's the same thing when we think about board governance today. So I am I want to make sure I can see everybody. So if by a show of hands, can you, let's see, who is currently a board member? So it looks like we have 3, and you can use the reactions at the bottom of the Zoom. You can raise your hand there. So it looks like we got about 4 or 5, and I'm guessing the rest of you are aspiring to be board members. Is that a fair assumption?
Or have been on boards before.
I'm sorry?
Or have been on boards before and not currently.
Sure. So if you're on a board, if you can put in chat how many years that you've served in that position.
Mine is 20 years.
20 years in board positions. Okay. You can probably tell us a few things.
Just one board, though.
Private or public?
It's a publicly traded company.
Publicly traded. And what about the rest of you? I see Jamie said 3.
That's correct, and that's an advisory board, and I didn't count all the not-for-profit boards, which are many and long years.
Okay.
Well over 20 or 30.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Their nonprofit boards can be quite interesting. And sometimes just as complicated. So for the rest of you, if you're not on a board and you're aspiring to be on a board, can you each tell me a little bit about your backgrounds? And feel free to come off mic, to come off mute. And, when I'm thinking background, have you been a CFO, chief marketing officer, chief human resources officer? Is there, particular function you're coming from or role?
I mean, my background is marketing and general management, and I've been on 2 PE-backed boards. I'm not on a board right now, other than EF. But yeah, and I was recruited for both my functional experience as well as my industry experience.
Okay, and I see ML. So I'm guessing that's Mark Lopez. That Mark was a CIO and COO. Russell, is that CLO, Chief Learning Officer, or Chief Legal Officer?
Legal.
Legal, okay. And let's see. Some CFO background. All right. So we're seeing a mix, and I'm going to talk about that mix and kind of what's been traditional, and how that's starting to change. How many of you have board certifications, and what certification, if you have board certification, do you have?
I have an ACD.
Jamie?
NACD as well, director certified.
Okay. Anybody else? I see Greg as NACD and a board leadership fellow. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, some of the certification programs and what future ready board members need to do to, go beyond that certification piece. So if we think about things now, turbulence and uncertainty is normal. Folks who said a couple of years ago, when things calm down, we can get back to doing things. Well, I don't know about any of you. I don't see calming down in anything when I look towards the future, at least not for at least 5 years, if not longer. And it has become a feature of the world we're in. So instead of thinking about turbulence and uncertainty as a bug, why can't we think about it as a feature? And if it's a feature, what kind of capabilities do we need to have so we can leverage it as a feature? And how would we think about things instead of saying, okay, I can't wait for the turbulence to go away, I can't wait for things to calm down? What capabilities do I need, and how can I leverage what my company is capable of to take advantage of those disruptions and uncertainty? And that's something we're going to be talking about a lot today. The other thing is we think about what we've learned through governance, through board training, through courses we might have taken. There tends to be a lot of discussion around ethics, oversight. What does oversight mean? Board structure, what are the key positions, the key committees, processes, board minutes, things you're supposed to do, legally, and to be in compliance as a board member, financial reporting. But the big focus very often there is on compliance. How do we make sure we're doing all the right things? But I think there's a gap when you think about what's not addressed. Certification and a lot of the academic programs don't address how do you govern when disruption and uncertainty are the norm. Those of you who are board members, probably feel like you're doing a whole lot more than what you thought you would do when you first got on the board. And you're being asked, greater responsibility, greater scope, things that were never issues before are all of a sudden issues now. The certification programs and a lot of the academic programs, whether it's at Wharton or Harvard or any place else, typically don't get into boardroom dynamics. How should the board function as a group? How should meetings be conducted so that everybody has a voice, that it's okay to speak up? And I know from a lot of folks that I speak to who are in the boardroom, they talk about people in the company needing development, but very few board members look in the mirror and say, I need development. By being on a board, I've been a CEO, CFO, whatever that position has been, you think you know what you need to know. And I challenge that thinking, especially in today's environment, that there's a lot we don't know, we've not seen before. So that becomes very important, especially if we think about the board role. How do we move from compliance to being a value contributing board member? What does that look like?
Is it me or did this freeze?
Am I okay? Can you all? Okay.
Okay.
You know, is what we have fit for purpose? Is the board operating the way that supports the company's strategy? And fit for the future, is it structured and being run and being led in discussions that are helping the company and the board be fit for the future? So here's the scary part, you know, is asking the question, what's the cost of maintaining the status quo? You know, if you think about in your boardroom, you know, the question I like to ask, you know, is there a ticking time bomb under the table that people aren't seeing? Maybe there has been, and now you're recovering from that. Or maybe there might not be. But if you think about the risks of maintaining the status quo, the types of things that I've seen are companies that are constantly firefighting. The board, the leadership team is being forced to react because they didn't see something coming. They ignored signals. They're dealing with operational issues, and they can't step back and look at the longer term and look on strategy. And firefighting might be, you know, appropriate when you have an episodic crisis, you know, a data center burns down or a cyber breach, you know, a power outage, a hurricane, you know, whatever that happens to be. Sure, you can firefight. But if you're firefighting all the time, and we're seeing the impact of this, people are getting burned out, leaders are turning over, board members are, you know, resigning. It's more than they thought that they were going to be asked to do. You know, so that goes to talent being drained. If we're feeling all these risks very often, and I'm sure some of you experience this, whether it's in your role as a director or being a member of a leadership team working with directors, there tends to be, when things get bumpy, playing not to lose versus playing to win. I mean, how many of you, by a show of hands, have seen that? You know, that you feel like you're in a playing not to lose versus a playing to win position. I'm seeing a few nods there. Okay. And, you know, when you're playing not to lose, you're avoiding risk very often. You're not allowing for innovation because, you know, taking chances, taking small calculated risks, if you're afraid you're going to lose, if you're afraid something might not work, then innovation's not going to happen. You know, transformations get put on hold. And if the board can't reach a decision, or the board is sending mixed signals to the leadership team, very often that leads to bottlenecks. You know, the board's not able to make a decision. They put something off to the next meeting. And the results of that is very often, if you're not future ready and you have problems, your downside risk gets amplified. And not only that, but because you're so busy digging yourself out of the ditch, you're missing opportunities that your more nimble competitors who recover faster, who are paying more attention, are able to take advantage of. And there's cost to that friction. So the key, as you think about making this change, is around future readiness. Now, some of you are probably, you know, have been thinking, what is future readiness? What does it mean to be future ready? You know, you hear people talk about companies being future proof. Well, I don't like to say future proof because you can't be future proof unless you know exactly what the future is going to be, and none of us know that. So I like to talk about future readiness. This idea of being ready for what's next. So if you look at the definition, future readiness is the capability of a leader, leadership team, board, and the organization overall. And here's the key: consistently anticipate, adapt, and act amid uncertainty and disruption and rapid change before circumstances force a response. So as you think about this idea of before circumstances force a response, we're trying not to be reactive, because if you're in a position where you're forced to respond, in many cases, you're too late. And in an environment that is moving so quickly, and where competitors are moving, where technology is changing, falling behind is a really bad place to be. Because, if others are racing past you, will you ever catch up? And, there are lots of companies who have gone by the wayside because they didn't anticipate what was coming. They didn't, pay attention to signals. I mean, you can look at Kodak, you can look at Blockbuster. I mean, those are classic examples where they failed to anticipate the changes that were taking place, even when there were signals. They chose to ignore those signals, or they thought they were too big to be impacted by, these insurgent competitors. So I have a question for everybody. When you think about anticipate, adapt, and act, tell me which one is most challenging. If you think about the board you're on, if you think about the role you have in leadership. So I'm going to call on some folks to get, some other folks involved. So how about Robin?
Sorry, was searching for the mute button. I would say it's the anticipating. All are challenging, but anticipating, I think, is, you really have to have the right team that has good foresight and a right mix of backgrounds in order to be able to anticipate what can come next.
Sure. And we're going to talk about, what you can do to, to better anticipate. I think the thing here is it's not about, you have to predict the future. You just have to be ready for it, that adaptability. What about you, Phil?
I think to pick the third one that you haven't spoken to, act, it's important if you have the excellent anticipation, the right team, right data points to guide, and you think you know how to adapt, then you have to have the executional capability, the executional resources, systems, people, process.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Catherine.
I mean, I was also going to say to anticipate, to really be future leaning on what the company should be thinking about. I think that's a big challenge.
Jay, it's Jim
What do you?
Cornelson. It's Jim Cornelson. I also
Yes.
pick anticipate because I think in today's environment, you may not know who your competitors are, and there may be small incremental steps that are very difficult to anticipate because things are moving so fast.
Yes, it's almost an analogy. One of my mentors, used to say, you look in the rear view mirror, you don't see anything. If it's another car, you eventually see it. If it's a jet flying at 600 miles an hour, by the time you see it, it's because it's speeding past you. It was so far back, you didn't see it coming. Cheryl?
So actually, I think adaptation is the hardest because it's about change. So even if you sort of recognize that these other, maybe new competitors popping up, et cetera, and what they're doing, I think organizations sort of get stuck a bit in their own way of going, way of doing. And I think of adaptation as change. And I think change is one of the hardest things. I think you get stuck in the middle of those three things. Because I think once you can make the change, right, you can recognize the change is needed, then I think it sets you up to be able to take some action around that. So for me, it was the middle.
Is it a resistance to change from the board, the leadership team, or both? In your experience.
Yeah. So I think there's I think it tends to be, I shouldn't put it on management, but obviously you look for management to really run the organization, right? So, I mean, boards, future-ready boards can be very effective in terms of asking the right questions, around that adaptation. But, I think inertia is pretty easy. I mean, sometimes big or your infrastructure doesn't allow you to be as flexible or as responsive, even if there is an inertia around it. Sometimes it's just you're not. It's like you think about, I'm a marketer by background. I mean, think about the whole new products, new products versus any, sort of innovation in your organization. We tend to fixate on the base business as opposed to making investment in things that, can really change the business going forward. So.
Well, and the thing, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but your thought about, it should be management. And you think about what the board can do, how the board influences management, types of conversations, how you hold the CEO and the rest of that team accountable. We'll talk about various levers on how you can do that. Andreas? Okay, what about Roman? What about Patrick? Let's go to somebody on camera. Nate.
Yeah, so from I guess a perspective of not having sat on a board, but acting currently as an executive advisor to a CEO, where there's a couple other executive advisors that meet with him, and also sat on leadership teams, I would have said adapt is the toughest, especially from the board perspective, because you have to, ultimately it's the organization that has to adapt. So you're pretty far away from the change that has to happen. So, and frankly, change is uncomfortable, and getting everybody on the same page with the change. And it starts with, as the board on the same page as the leadership team, but then actually they've also got to get that pushed all the way down to the organization, right? And so often, I actually was just listening to the CMO of Chili's on a podcast yesterday, who's a friend of mine. He was talking about when the new leadership came in, it was clear they needed a change, but they had a mixture of new people, old people. Getting the old people on board with new ideas isn't necessarily the easiest. So I think there's a lot of challenge to that actual adaptation. I am trying to differentiate a little bit between adapt and act in terms of when you go from where does adapt start and act start, or where does adapt stop and act start? But anyhow,
I mean, there's a little bit of bleeding over. I mean, the adapt piece I see as the development piece. It's some of the thinking you have to go through, making the decisions, and acting is actually doing it, making the change, embedding it in what the organization does. One of the things that's interesting that I've seen with a lot of organizations, this whole topic of change has come up. And people see change as being risky. But what I don't think people always see, very often I think there's a sense that if we don't change, there's no risk. And very often I find part of my role, if I think about this work now or when I would do strategy execution, balance scorecard work in a former life, what is the cost of not changing and making that more explicit so it becomes very hard to ignore? Because if you don't feel what that cost is, if you're not thinking about it, it's very easy to say, okay, we're not going to do this. And I'm going to talk about that. Any other comments before we move on? So I want to introduce a model. And this is actually something I'm going to be talking about at the PDA conference. In this question, does the board create or erode value? Now, the first thing somebody said to me, well, the board really doesn't create value. And I challenge that thinking, because by the decisions the board makes or decisions they don't make, that determines if value is being created or value is being lost. If the board allows change not to happen, if the board does not push change to happen and doesn't hold the CEO accountable, that could erode the value. If the board, in terms of choosing the CEO, or the board decides not to invest in something for whatever the reason, potentially erodes value. So in this example, and it's kind of interesting because quantitative and finance folks tend to like this one a little more because it begins to quantify what we're talking about. So that first variable, strategy, I like to use kind of what I call the base case. You have your strategy. You have what you're thinking about doing over the next 3 to 5 years. If we assume, for this case, our assumptions are right, there's no extraneous disruptions, strategy gets perfectly executed, what is that strategy worth? So that's not a number that I come up with when I'm talking to clients. That's their number. What do they think their strategy is worth if everything's done right? That's then impacted by what is the quality of governance? Do you have a board that's forward thinking, progressive? It's not just, I keep on hearing, noses in, fingers out. And, very often, I think sometimes folks see that as being passive, being somewhat from a distance, sniffing around. What I've been talking about lately is brains in, fingers out. You got to bring your head to the game. It's not just, passively observing. It's about the board being able to make timely decisions to help with the allocation of resources. Our investments being made in critical initiatives, or is the board holding its powder, for something else? So when you think about this, think about going from 0.5 to 1.5. 1 means the board's neutral. It's neither eroding or creating value. 0.5 or something lower than 1 means the board is adversely impacting value. And of course, if you go to 1.5, the board's running on all cylinders and actually amplifying value. The next factor is leadership. So here we're talking about management and how effective they are as leaders. And whether thinking about leadership alignment, thinking about how clear leaders are in communicating strategy, holding people accountable, developing talent, that can obviously impact positively or negatively enterprise value, culture. Here we can be talking about culture of the board, culture of the relationship between the chair and the CEO, the board and the executive team, and culture inside the company. Culture can be a positive influence. It can amplify value, or it can be unhealthy, even toxic, and impair value. And the last factor is what's going on in the environment, the rest of the world. From economics to geopolitics to tariffs to trade, climate, can be a whole host of factors. Now, the thing that's interesting, the board can influence and in some cases control 4 of the 5 factors. But the question is, do boards actually act on those 5 factors? It's very easy to say, when COVID was happening, with all the trade issues and geopolitical issues now, it's very easy for a leader or board to say, we don't know what's gonna happen. Everything's completely out of our control. Well, the reality is, it's not out of your control. You don't get to choose your circumstances, but you do get to choose how you're going to respond. What are you going to do with the things you can control? And if you think about some companies for a moment. Think about Boeing a year and a half ago. Boeing had a strategy, and they thought they were going to make all this money and value out of the strategy, until there were some disasters. And then it started to come out that governance was poor. Leadership was poor in terms of what they were communicating, decisions they were making. Talking to people who were at Boeing, and I've had Boeing people in some of my sessions, the culture was toxic. It was covering your butt. And that made, if you combine those things together, that made a bad situation much, much worse. And if you look at what's changed with Boeing, not perfect, but with new leadership, the tenor of governance has changed, leadership has changed, culture is becoming healthier, and their stock price is reflecting that. If you want to hear, a good story, think about Southwest Airlines or even Delta Airlines. You think about they execute their strategy. The strategy was well thought out. Governance is strong. Leadership in Southwest has always been regarded as strong. And culture, up until the recent layoffs, was incredibly strong. So if you think about, Southwest going through the turbulence of the last 5 years, say compared to a Spirit or a United, American Airlines, they were amazingly resilient. So by having this future readiness, can make a bad situation tolerable, and even positive, which means when things turn around, you're going to be in a much better position to take advantage of those opportunities. So let me pause there, because I'm curious, what questions do you have about the model? Does this start to help put potentially some numbers around in the significance of the opportunity that you can get by improving and moving those different levers? Greg, any thoughts?
I guess my initial thought is, how do you operationalize this? Do you put numbers from 1 to 10 on how prepared you think you are, or how good you think your strategy is, or your governance, or your leadership? Like what? And then you multiply them and you get a number. And then is there a benchmark?
Yeah. First of all, the number is relevant within your company and how you, board members see themselves relative to what they could be doing. When I'm presenting this to PDA, I'm kind of giving a red, yellow, green. Red, I'm calling 0.5. Yellow is 1, which is kind of neutral. And green is 1.5, and people can rate themselves in between. So if in the strategy is a number, so your CFO probably can say, go take the projections, we execute, these things happen on time. What's the present value of that number? What's the hard number? So that's a given. So if you say, let's just say 0.9 is governance, it's a little adverse. Leadership is 0.9, culture is 0.9. So if you look at that, 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9 is 0.72 something, whatever the value is. So 28% of the value is potentially at risk. If you can move the lever, then you can increase that value. Small changes have big impact because of the constant. What's the value of your strategy? And in going through this, let's say for argument's sake, for math, to make it easy, 72% of $1 billion is 720 million. For argument's sake, let's say it's going to cost 280,000 to have some advisors, some training to help your board and leadership team address these issues. That investment of 280,000 has a return of 280 million if things are perfect. We can be off by a factor of 10, and it's 100 times return. We can get 1% of the benefit, and it's a 10 times return. These are my numbers. This is what the board or the leadership team would be saying. Point being, that is an investment that's worth making. But a lot of boards, again, they say, we're fine. We're doing all this stuff right. They don't think about investing in themselves. The leadership team doesn't think they need more development. It's always the people below them. And what I'm trying to show here is by working those levers, you can make dramatic changes. So, kind of challenging the thinking that, we're good enough. We're CEOs, we're CFOs, we know what we're doing. And I'm saying, in this type of environment, maybe not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I found that when I've been on a board where we would rate ourselves. How are we doing every year as individuals and as a group? And I find when we do it ourselves, then we were like, should it be anonymous? Should everybody know who's rating who, what? One of the challenges was we always thought we were better than maybe we were. So bringing in a third party is sometimes we found value in, because they would interview each person and have discussions and come up with some opportunities for improvement versus all of the board and leadership team getting together and saying how great we are at governance. Or any of those.
It's easy to pat yourself on the back. The thing that's interesting, when I approach this is it's in your context. Mm-hmm. So, good governance for a SaaS company that's fast moving, rapidly changing is different than what good governance looks like for a railroad where things don't change very quickly. Mm-hmm. that idea of future readiness is different in each case. Meeting quarterly, being a little more deliberative for a railroad, makes sense. On the other hand, if you're Oracle or you're NVIDIA or any high-tech startup, medtech, fintech, you don't have that luxury.
Mm-hmm.
Jay, Greg raised an interesting point. For each of these factors, there's an individual rating as well as a group rating. How do you work with boards to get everyone aligned? Because clearly, at least in terms of the boards I participated in, people are going 5 different directions.
So I look at a couple of things. So I have an online survey that I'll share a link to at the end of the presentation that looks at individuals. Are you a future ready leader? And it looks along a number of dimensions, which I'm going to talk about in terms of capabilities. That's one level, and that's a self-assessment. How do I think I'm doing? The second, which is very telling, is a board assessment, a board survey, where you're assessing the board collectively. Now, as you look at that, if everybody says, oh, I'm great, I'm great, I'm great, but then they rate the board not so great, that begins to, point towards some of the dynamics, what's happening in the process, maybe a need to be more truthful, in your self-assessment, because the board isn't just individuals, it's how the board functions collectively. So I think it's important to look at both levels, because you'll see as I go through the capabilities, part of being future ready, for the board to be future ready, individuals need to have certain capabilities and be more future ready. So it kind of operates on 2 levels. Jim, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
Jay, can I ask a question? Actually, I've got 2 questions. One is,
Please.
is there a checklist, right, that the board uses against each of these vectors, for lack of a better word, or these elements? So that's the first question. And the second question, is there any comparison that is done? So as Greg said, people tend to be very generous to themselves. Is there any sort of, the board assesses itself, the management team assesses the board, and I don't know, maybe you get together a cross-section of shareholders or other stakeholders to assess the board and to see where the board may be either giving itself too credit or maybe even blind to its own strengths in terms of, again, it's difficult to assess yourself, right, accurately. And that's why I'm wondering if there is either a checklist that they're doing it against, right? And or is there some sort of comparison that their assessment goes up against versus other stakeholders of the board?
So a couple of things. It's a fair question. How deep is a company willing to go in terms of who they're going to talk to or not talk to? I think part of the thing, I'm not a big fan of checklists, because ticking the box it's not about ticking the box. The question is it effective? Is it functional? Is it creating value?
Like checklist, I meant just a list, literally a list of questions on which you would assess yourself on strategy, on governance. In other words, rather than people sort of sitting around and saying, gee, are we good at strategy? Yeah, we're pretty good at strategy. Scale of 1 to 5, we're pretty good at strategy. Is there sort of literally a list of questions that the board needs to be asking itself on each of these dimensions? And then having another group of stakeholders answer the same sort of questions, assessing the board.
So I think, first of all, and when we get into the superpowers, which we're going to do momentarily, is I have questionnaires that look at each of the superpowers, that look at certain capabilities. But it's it's important to look at those capabilities in context. So it's not just about strategy, it's about strategy execution. If you might be great at strategy, but if you're not executing, it's not worth anything. And if you're great at execution, you're a real operator, you're efficient, but you don't have a strategy. Very often you're very busy, but do you know where, are you heading in the right direction? So yes, there are underlying factors within that context. So I try not to be overly prescriptive. I have some core elements. We get into the superpowers, you'll see that. I think when you have the leadership team and the board answer those same set of questions, especially looking at each other, that can be very telling and at least keys up that discussion, which very often doesn't take place. So I'm trying to elevate, escalate the discussion. Now, when you think about this, I'm going to get into the capabilities. This will make a little more sense. So when I talk about new capabilities are needed, we've talked about that, what got you here won't get you where you're going. What we learned in business school was very functional. We come from companies that are siloed and that are very functional. Some of us are probably more operations oriented, more strategy oriented. And very often we see things as binary choices. I can do this or I can do that. And in developing the 5 leadership superpowers, which is this capability framework I developed, it's based on 25, 30 years of consulting experience, Fortune 500 companies, large private companies, middle market companies, talking to executives across a wide range, talking to board members, and looking at, where are people running into trouble? Why do they get surprised? Well, very often they get surprised as they have a tension they have to manage. Do I focus on the present, what's in front of me, or do I focus on the future? And people say, oh, I can do this or I can do that. No, you need to do both. You need to focus on the present. And, that first superpower is being a present futurist. You have to focus on the present. You want to talk to stakeholders, but at the same time, you have to know, directionally, where am I heading? You have to monitor trends. You have to look at signals. You have to think through different scenarios. You blend the two together to inform decisions on an ongoing basis. Because if you pick one side and ignore the other side, there are negative consequences. But when you do both, those negative consequences go away. So being able to integrate the two, so that's the first tension. The second tension is between experience and learning. As I observed, over the last 7 years, even before then, when things get rough, the first thing people do is they go back to what they know. And we saw this during COVID. People tried to go back to the old way and said, we'll make this work here. When that didn't work, sometimes they doubled down and said, okay, we're just not doing it hard enough. And sometimes they tripled down instead of saying, things are different. I need to learn. I need to ask questions. I need to foster debate. I need to invite a diversity of opinions. I, too, as an executive, I need to learn. So I'm not saying disregard experience, but sometimes we have to let things go. We have to unlearn the way we used to do things so that we can learn what's effective. In an environment that's changing so rapidly, learning needs to be ongoing. And again, I think what's interesting, when I talk to leaders, they say, oh, I'm all for developing talent. I'm all for, investing in training and coaching and all these things. But they're looking from the neck down. They're not looking at themselves, which is equally as important. And it's not just to say, oh, I took a lot of courses. I'm taking things that are going to move the needle, and I'm taking things that I can apply. Because if you're just looking and saying, oh, we all took 20 hours of training, well, that's wonderful. You spent a lot of money. Did it help you do anything? Was it purposeful? The next one is between preparedness and risk taking, the prepared risk taker. So the first thing I'll say up front, risk is a part of business. Whether you do something or don't do something, there's risk. Yeah, I had somebody say, you want leaders to be risk takers, you want boards to be risk takers. Yeah, I had somebody say, I don't want my CFO to be a risk taker. I want my CFO to be a bean counter. Well, when you think about this, it's about taking smart risks. It's about prototyping. It's about piloting. It's about innovating, learning, refining before you place those bigger bets. But risk is part of what we do. You can't avoid risk. And it's, how do you prudently make decisions? I think the second piece I'll call risk awareness or risk intelligence. Thinking about the continuum of risks. When I looked at 10Ks and financial reports in the UK, EU, Australia, in the 10K in the US, there's 10, 15 boilerplate items that are on the 10K that talk about risk. They're very discreet in very many cases, a fire, a data breach, a cybersecurity issue, access to resources, and then there's that catch-all category and everything else. When you're looking at risks in isolation, there's so much you're not looking at. Whether it's a pandemic, whether it's tariffs, whether it's trade war, whether it's geopolitical issues, whether a competitor coming up with a new business model, a new technology coming. So that risk awareness is so important, that risk intelligence, and it's not just looking individually, but how do these risks interact is equally as important. So that's the second piece. The third piece is around preparedness. And people would say to me, oh, I never could have been prepared for COVID. And I'll be the first one to say, nobody was perfectly prepared, but there were companies who, knew how to work remotely because they knew things could happen. If you're in Florida and there's a hurricane or you lose power, what are you going to do? I spoke to somebody, a colleague of mine who worked for HSBC. And he said, once we got through the World Trade Center, when they bombed the parking lot, he said, we recognized we need to have laptops and we need to be able to operate remotely. So he said, so when 9/11 hit, everyone had laptops. We were able to get things up and running. When COVID hit and we had to work from home, not a big deal. We had things up and running. But how many companies didn't do that? And, in the Northeast, where I'm assuming, most of you are from, although not exclusively, we get blizzards. So you probably have batteries at home, you probably have water, you probably have more toilet paper, since COVID, food, stuff that you have. Well, what's the corporate equivalent of having some of those basics? ever since 9/11, I think more families have communication plans. How do we get in touch with each other? What do we do in case of certain things? So there's some basic preparedness things. I'll give you an example. There's a woman who was over corporate communications for Popeyes, and she took this job about 6 months prior to COVID, and they had a health issue at one of their locations, and all of a sudden she found out they didn't have a communications plan for health issues. In this case, it was an employee who had tuberculosis. And she's like, what do you mean we don't have a communication plan? That should be a no-brainer. What do we do when something like that happens? So, it's a lot of those similar type things. And, I had a CFO say to me, well, what's the return on being prepared? Why would I want to spend money on something that might never happen? And I said, well, how is that working? And the second thing I said was, you spend a lot of money on insurance. What's the return on insurance? When you think about insurance, you might get some money back. You haven't built any capabilities. You're certainly not any better off. But when you think about these superpowers, as you start to apply them, they are like insurance for a far wider range of issues, and you're building capabilities. So being a prepared risk taker is not about just during bad times. It's in good times too. Each of these superpowers helps you in a rough situation. It helps you get through that. But it helps good companies go to great companies because they're building those capabilities. Next is being a strategic executor. How do I balance strategy and operations? One is recognizing strategy and execution need to be linked. You can't have one conversation without the other. I think the second part, and I'll use Delta Airlines as an example in talking about a strategic executor. Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta, within days of COVID hitting, they had lost 95% of their business, in a matter of days. He had an all-employee call. The first thing he said was, we're throwing out the flight plan. That was their strategic plan. He said, it's not relevant. Plain and simple. He said, we're going to focus on three things. Number one was the safety of our passengers and the safety of our employees. Job one. Job two was protect cash. We don't know how long this is going to last for. So we need to, make sure we have funds so we can outlast this. And the third thing he said, which very few companies did, is we need to protect our future because we're going to come out on the other side of this. And that idea of protecting the future led them to not just having these massive layoffs. They did furloughs. It led them to stay in touch with their employees and keep them engaged. It led to, how they, had empty seats in between longer than other airlines did. It kept people informed. And the result of that, when flying came back, Delta came back faster and stronger than the other airlines did. And that's translated into an advantage, that's now lasted a couple of years. He's one of the most admired CEOs. Delta is one of the most admired companies. And a fact that blew me away, they had high employee engagement before COVID. They had higher employee engagement after COVID. I challenge United or American or other airlines, were they able to do that? So part of it is don't make short-term decisions that impair long-term performance. That's part of being a strategic executor. And the last one, being an accountable collaborator. Everybody's keen on accountability. And accountability very often is code for who do I point the finger at when something goes wrong? Look at it a different way. First of all, I break the word accountable into two words: account, which means count, and able. You have to be able to do the work. It's not just about being empowered, it's about being enabled. And this collaboration piece, most of the things we're talking about, most of the challenges we're facing as organizations are complex. One department can't solve the problem. So it's about working cross-functionally. It's about working with ecosystem partners. When I was at this healthcare summit yesterday, it's not just the doctors, it's the healthcare systems, it's the social service agencies, it's the tech vendors, all of them working together to drive better outcomes. And when when you have a team that's fit for purpose, getting the right people on the right projects with the right capabilities, irrespective of level, irrespective of organizational structure, they can take shared ownership. And the team can be accountable for outcomes. Think about a special forces team. The team succeeds or fails together. It's about the team. You think about soccer, you think about rugby, football, basketball, any of those sports. It's about the team. It's not about individuals. So when you look at all these taken together, they're very powerful. So let me pause there. I'm going to go through each one in a little more detail. What questions do you have so far?
I'd keep going, Jay.
Okay. So we can look at each of these examples. This idea of, Helena, you said, how do people assess themselves? What are we doing to robustly understand the present? Are we talking to all of our stakeholders? Do we stay in touch with our stakeholders? Are we paying attention to what is going on around us? Is very important. How are we doing that? About anticipating the future, do we have people who are looking at industry studies, marketing studies, looking at trends? Rita McGrath, wrote the book about seeing around corners. Are people looking around the corners? Are we doing things that help us think through different types of futures, foresight? Are we looking at different scenarios? I used to be in banking. I think about scenarios that used to be high interest rate, low interest rate, or they were, we had a good case, sales really grow, sales flat, sales decline. We need more complex scenarios because, it's more complex now. What would we do if we had a supply chain issue and, a product recall? How do those things interact? And, when we make big decisions, when we're thinking about strategy, when we're thinking about where to invest, do we integrate present and future insights? So I use Mayo Clinic as an example. Mayo Clinic in the late teens started investing heavily in digital. They were anticipating that digital, things like telehealth, more effective use of electronic health records, that's where things were going. And that's where they started investing. That's where they started, setting up partnerships with different technology companies. So, it's being more forward thinking. So it comes back to, as a board member or as a board, are we asking the right questions about what's coming? Are they adding that to the discussion? When we think about experienced learner, are we leveraging but challenging experience? If all of the members of the leadership team are deferential to the CEO and they just nod, or everybody on the board is deferential to the chairman, and something's not right. That past experience doesn't make sense. That expertise is no longer relevant. You should be challenging it, and it should be safe to do so. Being curious and open to new ideas. People, I've had CEOs say to me, "Why didn't they just talk to me? They had this idea." And I say, "Well, what do you think it takes for you to get an idea?" Because, your managers want the ideas to go through them. They decide what moves up. They talk to their boss, and it gets diluted. And by the time it gets to you, it's completely changed. It might not even get to you. So how do you get around that? Gary Ridge, former CEO and chairman of WD-40, they got rid of the word failure in their organization, and they talk about learning moments. That if there's a failure, something didn't work, a new formulation didn't work, a new product didn't work, people weren't branded with an F that they had to walk around for the rest of their lives with at WD-40. How do we learn from this, and what can we do differently? Now, that didn't mean people got off. If you repeated the same learning moment multiple times, then they took action. But the point was, it was believed that people's intent was positive. And how do we learn from this? So that psychological safety and that continuous learning. And in the case of Unilever, I think it was in 2017, they had activists, investors that were looking at them. I think Kraft Heinz tried to buy them in a hostile takeover. And what they learned through that process is where were some areas of hidden value that they weren't taking advantage of that others saw. And they use that in subsequent years to strengthen their company. So that's a perfect example of learning from experience and leveraging that learning, being open to it. So, this idea is your board learning, because learning is more than just listening. Does your board encourage and enable honest, inclusive dialogue and debate? Or, is the discussion, at a leadership team meeting or a board meeting, oh, let's take that offline. Or, no, we're not talking about that now. Or, we're going in this direction. That dialogue and debate very often makes all the difference in the world. When we think about prepared risk takers, navigating risk strategically, are we placing smart bets? What does that mean we do? In terms of innovation, are we balancing boldness with pragmatism? Are we improving our risk intelligence? So it's not just about, did we update the risk ledger or the risk register? Because we have to look at risks differently. We don't just look at risks once a year. Risks are changing all the time. So it's improving that risk intelligence and that preparedness. And, in the case of Samsung, they made investments. This again was the late 2010s. They invested in very, I can't think of the right word, but video chips that led them to take such market share in LED and OLED in the different television technologies. And they did that before the demand was there, but they saw things coming. They felt, that was a good bet to make. But if they didn't take that chance, they wouldn't be where they are today. So, taking those smart risks, if all you're thinking of, oh, we're not going to take a risk until we know exactly what's going to happen. Well, chances are somebody's already done it before you. You're never going to get that perfect information. So, questions for the board. How does your board balance bold, smart moves with real preparedness? What has the board done to improve its holistic risk intelligence? I'll give you guys an idea that I've spoken a lot about. Instead of trying to figure out every possible risk, inverse the question. And you say, what are the key drivers of my business? So if I'm Hilton, a key driver of my business is occupancy. So then the second question is, well, what can impact occupancy? The economy, terrorism, economic conditions, are people spending for travel? If you think about, with COVID and with Zoom, are people having those large conferences? Are people spending, all this money on high-end catering events? If you ask about the risks to drivers, you're going to uncover more things you need to pay attention to. So it brings certain things to light, and then you can determine, is that important or not important? And this idea about preparedness as well. In being a strategic executor, I talked about integrating strategy and execution. When I was doing a lot of the balanced scorecard work, very often it was, how are we operationalizing strategy? Have we converted it to operational terms? So strategy isn't grow shareholder value. That's not a strategy. Saying we want to grow 10% is not a strategy. How are you going to do it? Is it new markets? Is it new customers? Is it going from transactional selling to relationship selling? You have to integrate the two pieces. You have to balance strategy and operations. You can't just focus, in one area at the expense of another. And it's this idea about adaptively managing strategy, because it's constantly, you have to change. It doesn't mean you change everything, but like the CEO of Delta threw out their flight plan, it wasn't relevant. You have to be able to pivot and adjust how you're executing, based on some of the conditions you're facing. This company, Discovery, is a South African-based company, very technology-centric. They've integrated health insurance, life insurance, financial services. A lot of it's behavior-based. They're doing dynamic pricing for health insurance. So if you have a wearable, so say like an Apple Watch that communicates, your health, are you walking, are you doing these things, you might get a better rate than somebody else. So there's that dynamic adjustment, but the board knew for that strategy to work, they had to invest in technology. So they resourced that strategy, they looked into that. And of course, at times they had to adjust that strategy, as different regulations in different markets, and now in 30 countries. So, connecting strategy with operations, and, this idea about adaptive strategy management. You can't lock in strategy in January and say, okay, we're not going to adjust this until we get to next January or 2 years out when we have an offsite. The strategy, execution, and strategy are dynamic today. If you lock something in and you're not open to adjusting or changing when it's clear what you've chosen to do isn't working, that's not a good choice. And, if we're thinking about being an accountable collaborator, Helene, you have a question?
I didn't have a question. I just want to point out, I don't know if people have a hard stop or not, but it's 7 of the hour, and I know you have a bit more to go through. So I know somebody actually just wrote to me to say that they have a call at 7 p.m. So again, just kind of wanted to give you a time check.
Okay. So with this being an accountable collaborator, are you collaborating across boundaries? Is that fostered, or do things have to go up the chain in the silo? Are you forming fit for purpose teams? Irrespective of organizational structure, but does every team have to fit the structure? Does every team have to have representation from every department? So each of these, Helena, going back to your question, are there things that we assess? Absolutely. Are there things that we can look at and say, are you doing these things? And what that looks like in each company is going to be a little bit different. And again, some questions. The thing is, with the superpowers, each one of the superpowers supports and reinforces the other. Present futurist informs what you need to learn, what kind of workforce do you need. It lets you know about risks that might be coming up, how you need to collaborate, what you need to learn, what type of culture. And I think a perfect example of all 5 superpowers in action is Costco. In terms of how they anticipate and think about the future, what things are important. Having private label brands, because they know customers are concerned about cost. And it's not just run-of-the-mill private label brands, they're premium brands. They're premium products that have, meet, top line standards that they can offer at a lower price. So they were prepared to do that. If you think about being experienced learners, they try different things in their stores. They see how a product does before they jump in with both feet. Being a prepared risk taker. If you think about what they've done about DEI and ESG and some of the things that other companies have just dropped. Costco knows those things are important to their customers. They've made some decisions. They've put things up to vote. This is what their shareholders want. They're not afraid to do that. When people have said, why do they pay their people so much money? They should cut costs. They can make more money. They're making a long-term bet. They pay their people because they keep their people. Retail has so much turnover. They don't. So it's decisions like that. They execute so well. You think about the health of their culture. Everybody can help you. It's not about fancy dress. It's not about commissions. Everybody's aligned around a common purpose, and everybody helps each other. Accountable collaborator. It's all about the team. So we should think about all these things together. Now, here's the interesting part. When I talk about the power of 5, a board should have all 5 superpowers. If it's missing any one, there are going to be blind spots. Individuals don't need to be experts in all 5. I'd say individuals should strive to be proficient in 1 to 3. Some of us, might be proficient in all 5. That's how we think. That's how we operate. That's great. For other folks, these things can be learned, they can be tried, they can be experimented with. What are the benefits? Better understanding the present, foreseeing the future, building critical capabilities, not leaving things to chance, being intentional about design, being more resilient. And we've talked about the benefits, dampening downside risk, amplifying upside return because, we can do things faster. And that increases value for all stakeholders. If you think about it, go back for a second. If you think about stakeholders, customers are better served. They're listened to, their needs are met, service is great. Employees like to work in a place where they can have ownership, where they're empowered, where they're encouraged to learn and grow, and they have the tools to do their jobs. Partners like working with you because it's not a zero-sum game. You work together to achieve, objectives that benefit both sides. Society is better off because you're investing in the community. And when all of those things happen, shareholders win. And they win in a sustainable way. If you mistreat customers, you mistreat employees, shareholders might win in the short term, but long-term value is impaired. So this whole idea about future readiness and the superpowers, I think that gives you a competitive advantage. And that gives you a competitive advantage that I believe lasts. As long as you keep this up, you're always going to be ahead of the curve instead of behind it or being overtaken by it. Very, very quickly, I talked about these tensions and this idea of both and thinking. You think about leadership mindset and leadership behavior. This idea that a leader can be confident and humble. I can be very knowledgeable, and at the same time, I can be curious. I can be vulnerable to engage people and recognize that doesn't threaten, power or authority that I have. I can be disciplined and still be adaptable. So a lot of this is around behavior and mindset. And it's about, getting more comfortable with that. So we talked about who wins when you become future ready. It's about moving from compliance and principles to the superpowers in practice. And this ties back to board responsibility, in terms of, superpowers support different risks, support different board processes. How do you select for the board? Superpowers are a great way to recruit board members. You want board members who are future ready, who have these capabilities. It's not just, I have AI expertise. Because if they can't do these things, they're going to be one-trick ponies. Things you can do, I know, for people who are thinking about, I'm in transition, I'm looking for a board position. Look at your experience and frame it with a future ready lens. How can you look at what you've done to demonstrate how you can adapt, how you can learn, how you handle risk? Share how you've invested in your own personal and professional development. So I think the superpowers and a lot of the principles we've talked about, you can repackage yourself for a board position, for your next executive position, because everybody else is talking about their experience and what they did 10 years ago. You're talking about what you can do going forward. And you can use the things we've talked about to formulate questions you're going to ask of your potential employer, potential board. Because if you ask questions that make them think, that all of a sudden they see things they haven't seen before, that makes you more valuable. And remember, it's not about yesterday. It's about tomorrow. We've talked about the benefits, things you can do. I think it starts with assessing your board and your own future readiness. It starts with the truth. Where are we now? And then holding dedicated board and leadership learning and strategy sessions. For the board to, learn about the superpowers and how they go about adjusting what they do. How do you develop a shared framework so the board and the leadership team are talking the same language? And how do you begin to embed future readiness in the organization? So I've alluded to the Are You a Future Ready Leader self-assessment. So you can use the QR code. More than happy to set up a discovery call. I'm going to be launching a board future readiness quick check. So it's going to be about 18 questions that a board chair, an entire board, can assess themselves and where they stand. So, Helena, what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a note together that can be sent to everybody. So I know a lot of folks, a few folks have had to have dropped off. So I want people to know, these resources are available. And, for the rest of the membership to know these things are available.